For 5,000 years, whoever controlled this water controlled the world's breath. The Persians understood this first. Then came the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. Then oil rewrote every calculation, and a corridor no wider than 21 miles became the most consequential passage on Earth. 21 million barrels of crude oil every single day. "72 hours. That is how long the global economy survives if this passage closes. And yet, on the island that gives this strait its name, a woman wakes before the heat arrives to check how much water remains in the drum because the ferry may not come today. An artist draws enormous figures across the red sand, knowing the tide will erase everything within hours, and draws them anyway. The world watches Hormuz and sees a choke point, a leverage point. It does not see the 6,000 people living on a volcanic salt mass with no groundwater, no arable soil, and no share in the trillion-dollar flow passing their windows every single day. They have been here longer than every empire. Not because the land relented, but because they never required it to. This is Unreal Hormuz. Stretching between the southern coast of Iran and the northernmost tip of Oman's Musandam Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz is, by any rational measure, one of the most improbable pressure points in human geography. At its narrowest, the usable navigation channel spans no more than 2 miles in each direction, a thread of open water suspended between clashing landmasses. The landscape does not look like a corridor. It looks like a wound. Yet, through this wound flows approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil every single day, roughly 1/5 of the world's total petroleum supply, carried in the bellies of supertankers so vast they cannot be fully seen from shore. For the people who live here, this is not extraordinary. These vessels move past Hormuz Island the way weather moves past a cliff face, enormous, indifferent, and leaving almost nothing behind. Like a sentry carved from the Earth's own fault lines, red and jagged against a sky that permits no softness. It must be read from both shores simultaneously, because the strait is not one place. It is a confrontation between two entirely different relationships with the same water. On the southern edge, Oman's Musandam Peninsula rises from the sea in pale limestone columns, deeply fissured by fjords that reach inland like fingers, quiet and sheltered. International tankers hug this southern corridor not only for the deeper water, but for the psychological comfort of its stillness. With patience, with calculation, and without urgency. To the north, Hormuz Island offers no such comfort. Unsettling red that gives the island its most persistent identity. The mountains do not invite. They confront. Where Musandam is smooth, Hormuz is fractured. Where Oman's shore suggests arrival, Hormuz suggests warning. And in the narrow water between them, 21 miles, gaze of two landmasses that agree on nothing except proximity. This is not a strait defined by what it connects. It is defined by what it divides and what it refuses to let pass without consequence. Camera low, moving across the flat rooftops of Hormuz village, dust-blown, vivid with pigment, and almost entirely empty of the wealth that surrounds them on every side. What happens when the world's most lucrative trade route passes directly in front of your door, and you are left with nothing but the smoke? For the residents of Hormuz Island, this question is not philosophical, it is the architecture of daily life. Every morning, the same supertankers that carry the financial heartbeat of industrialized civilization move through the water outside their windows. Every morning, the islanders wake to the same absence. No fresh water, no reliable employment, no access to the prosperity that glides past them on its way to somewhere else. The domed, rainbow-colored houses of the island's main settlement exist in permanent visual contradiction with their interiors, where the scarcity of water, income, and opportunity defines the rhythm of every household. The island sits on a mountain of volcanic salt, so saturated with minerals that no groundwater can form within it. Rain, the little that falls, evaporates before it can collect. Every drop of fresh water that enters a cup on Hormuz Island When the ferry is delayed, the island does not merely grow thirsty. It grows afraid. Men leave Hormuz regularly, crossing to the mainland, not to trade, not to travel, but to carry back plastic containers of water as though they were gold. There is a particular kind of beauty that belongs only to places is a byproduct of geological violence rather than a deliberate arrangement. Hormuz Island belongs entirely to this category. The red beach that curves along its western edge owes its color not to any single mineral, but to a collision of iron oxides, sulfur deposits, and volcanic ash compressed over millions of years into a shoreline that appears, in full afternoon sun, to be actively bleeding. The mineral-laden sand dissolves at the waterline, a gradient that exists nowhere else on Earth, and that no photograph fully captures, because no photograph can convey the smell of iron in sea air or the sensation of walking on a surface that feels geologically recent rather than ancient. Inland, the Rainbow Valley, a canyon corridor where exposed rock layers cycle through ochre, white, violet, and burnt orange, reads less like landscape, the interior life of a planet turned outward for examination. The silver beach, glittering with mineral flakes under direct sunlight, is a trap in the most literal sense. The dark, and in the tidal shallows on the island's quieter edges, Avicennia marina mangroves push upward from salt water, filtering toxicity through their leaves and converting the inhospitable into habitat, performing the same metabolic miracle that the island's human residents have been performing for centuries. Not escaping the hostility of the environment, but transforming it quietly and persistently into the condition of life itself. The strait that carries 21 million barrels per day carries not only oil. In the years following the intensification of international sanctions, a new phenomenon emerged in the waters off Hormuz. Their flags changed between ports, their ownership obscured behind layers of shell registration. These vessels, documented by maritime analysts and satellite tracking services under the collective designation of the Dark Fleet, do not pass through Hormuz invisibly. They simply pass through it unacknowledged, moving crude oil from sanctioned sources to willing buyers across a global network that has learned to exist in the gap between international law and economic necessity. From the shore of Hormuz Island, these ships look identical to any others. Their lights are the same. Their silhouettes are the same. But they represent a doubling of the strait's already extreme geopolitical load, a reminder that the 21 miles between Hormuz and Musandam are not merely a trade route, but a threshold, a point at which the entire architecture of global economic governance becomes visible in its limitations. Hormuz does not cause this. It simply reveals it, the way all narrow passages reveal what is being carried through them and, more importantly, what those carrying it are willing to risk. For a particular generation of young Iranians, Hormuz Island has become something that no government document designates and no official map acknowledges: a zone of relative freedom combined with its artists come to understanding this for centuries. The mainland is still learning. Hormuz is not simply a contemporary strategic asset. It is a geological archive of imperial ambition, layered in the same strata. The island's name itself belongs to an earlier geography applied first to a mainland port city that flourished under the Seljuk Empire as a hub of Indian Ocean trade, then transferred to the island offshore when that city fell to invasion in the 14th century. And the surviving population, the island that received them, was, in every physical sense, less hospitable than the city they had lost. They came anyway. The Portuguese arrived in 1507, recognized the strategic geometry of the strait within days of their first survey, and constructed the fort of Our Lady of the Conception, the ruins of which remain today, their coral and mud walls slowly dissolving back into the earth at a rate that the salt air accelerates each year. The Portuguese held Hormuz for over a century, before being expelled by a combined Safavid British force in 1622, an alliance so unusual and so instrumental that it effectively restructured the regional balance of maritime power. After the Dutch came the British. After the British came oil, and after oil came everything else. Each empire arrived certain it had discovered something permanent. Oxidized by time into the same dust that now settles on the windowsills of the people who were here before all of them, and who remain here still. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal? In the case of Hormuz Island, the answer is still being written, but its early chapters are already visible. The Rainbow Valley, once known primarily to the island's own residents and to a small number of Iranian domestic travelers, began appearing in international travel media with increasing frequency through the 2010s, documented in the kind of saturated, wide-aperture photography that strips geological phenomena of their context and renders them as pure visual product. The influx of visitors that followed brought income to a community that desperately needed it, and disruption to an ecosystem that was not designed to absorb it. The The salt formations that give the island its surreal color palette are, by their nature, fragile mineral deposits shaped over millions of years that can be dislodged by a boot heel, smeared by a hand. The mangroves of the Hara protected zone face pressure from boat traffic. The nesting grounds of the hawksbill sea turtle, protected on nearby Shidva Island, partly by the territorial behavior of its venomous snake population, are not immune. Hormuz is learning, in real time, the paradox that confronts every place whose unreality becomes its primary commercial value. That the recognition of beauty and the preservation of it are, more often than not, working in opposite directions at a pace that only becomes visible once. Before the supertankers, before the sanctions, before the satellite imagery and the geopolitical analysis and the energy security briefings that occupy the attention of governments on every continent, Hormuz was a fishing community. The men who operate the small wooden dhows from the island's harbor do not think about the 21 million barrels moving past them each day in any abstract policy sense. They think about it the way fishermen think about any large, regular disturbance to their working environment, as a source of wake turbulence that affects net deployment, as a source of fuel contamination that periodically renders certain fishing grounds temporarily unviable, and as a source of acoustic interference that displaces the pelagic fish populations whose behavioral patterns they have spent lifetimes learning to read. The fishing grounds of the Strait of Hormuz are, beneath the surface noise of geopolitics, among the most biologically productive in the Persian Gulf, fed by the nutrient upwelling generated by the density difference between the saltier surface water flowing out of the Gulf and the cooler, less saline water of the Gulf of Oman. This circulation, the same oceanographic mechanism that creates the strait's complex current patterns and makes navigation challenging for vessels without sophisticated equipment, is what feeds the fish, and therefore what feeds the fishermen, and therefore what has sustained Hormuz Island as a human settlement through every empire, every conflict, and every geopolitical reconfiguration of the past 5 centuries. The supertankers move through the same water. The fish do not recognize their authority. Reading the water the way their grandfathers read it, not as a stage for the drama of global power. And entirely indifferent to anything that does not swim. There is an hour on Hormuz Island, in the 40 minutes before sunset during the summer months, when the relationship between the light, the mineral content of the shore, and the salt particles suspended in the sea air combines to produce a visual experience that has no adequate prior reference point. The iron oxide in the soil and sand while filtering the blue, turning the ground beneath your feet from ochre to something approaching arterial. The water in the shallows, already tinted by mineral runoff, shifts toward a color that exists at the boundary between rose and rust, a color that appears in no standard vocabulary of natural description because it has no standard natural occurrence. Photographers who have documented this phenomenon consistently report the same experience, that no post-production adjustment makes the images look more accurate, because the images, even unmanipulated, do not look real. This is not a failure of photographic technology. It is a failure of the category of real to accommodate what Hormuz actually produces when conditions align. The island does not perform this for visitors. It performs it whether anyone is watching or not, The same light, a geological spectacle maintained across millions of years, with complete indifference to the human impulse to witness, document, or explain it. The people who live here do not gather to watch the sunset. They are inside, managing the final preparations of the evening meal, checking the water stores, listening to whether the wind has shifted. The beauty of Hormuz is, in the most precise sense, not for them. That is a different thing entirely. Every place that matters globally eventually generates a question that it cannot answer for itself, a question that its existence poses to the world outside it, and that the world outside it. Hormuz's question is this: how long can a civilization continue to root its most fundamental dependencies through a passage 21 miles wide, controlled by no single authority, contested by multiple competing powers, and physically located on one of the Earth's most geologically and climatically unstable coastlines, before the fragility of that arrangement becomes its defining characteristic rather than an acceptable risk? It has a mathematical dimension, the 72-hour calculation, the insurance premium applied to every barrel that transits this water, the fuel surcharges embedded in the price of manufactured goods worldwide that reflect in small fractions the cost of the Hormuz risk factor. But it is also a philosophical question, and the island itself is, in some sense, its most honest answer. Hormuz Island has never resolved its fragility. It has never engineered its way to security, never achieved the water independence that would make the ferry delay non-catastrophic, never developed the soil that would make the Galak harvest unnecessary for basic nutrition, never arrived at a condition that could be described as stable by the standards the modern world applies to that word. It has simply continued absorbing instability, incorporating it into culture, building systems of mutual support and distributed resilience that function not by eliminating risk, but by distributing it so widely across the community that no single failure is fatal. This is not a model that development economists usually recommend, and every disruption for longer than most modern states have existed. And the Strait keeps asking whether the rest of the world is paying attention. And lying so close to mainland Iran that in some areas the channel between them narrows to less than 2 miles. Within the island lies an unusually complete and exposed geological record, where moving across the terrain can feel less like traveling and more like reading, as if erosion has deliberately opened the landscape to reveal the processes that shaped it. The Valley of Stars, known locally as Darak, consists of eroded mudstone formations sculpted over millennia by wind and episodic flash floods. Its columns, ridges, cavities, and overhangs are so varied and irregular that the eye continuously searches for patterns but fails to find any coherent system.